I'm here. We are here with my good friend, my dear brother Karlo. I've had him on before, and I believe he was on yesterday with my brother Mike over there at Reason and Theology. I got to look at that show once I get some time. But Karlo, the reason I love having Karlo on, number one, people love you, Karlo. And number two, you've written an incredible book on a topic near and dear to my heart. I love talking about purgatory. Whenever anybody comes up to me, they tell me, William, I'm looking for a good book on purgatory. And I'm finding books from the early 1900s. I tell them, you got to check out Karlo's book, Purgatory is for Real. There'll be a link to it down here by the time this does air tonight. Purgatory is for Real. Good news about the afterlife for those who aren't perfect yet. In my opinion, an incredible book. You've done great research there, brother. You've broken it down great. And we've talked about the book here before, but one thing, Karlo, that comes up very often in the comments is Matthew 5. You've heard of it before, haven't you, brother?
Yep, Matthew 5, 25 through 26, right?
Yeah, definitely. You're correct. And let me go ahead and read it for the audience.
Sure.
In fact, let me start in verse 21. So people can get, I don't want people to think, hey, William and Karlo, y'all are avoiding all of the context. So here we go. You have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. Verse 22. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I tell you, you will by no means get out of there till you've paid the last penny. Some translations say farthing, but I think the whole context here is really, really important. Now, Karlo, I've got to ask you, because you've written an incredible book on this topic. What is going on here?
Yeah, well, as I argue in my book, Purgatory is for Real, I have a chapter on this, or at least part of a chapter on this particular verse, where I'm talking about purgatory and Jesus' teaching. I conclude that we have good reason to think Jesus is talking about a post-mortem prison or place of detainment where one is paying debt, discharging debt of punishment due for wrongdoing, and that this post-mortem prison, in Greek phulake there, and that'll be significant in a few moments, is temporary and not eternal. Yeah. So if it's a post-mortem state of existence that's not heaven because there is punishment due and undergoing of punishment, and it's not hell, given the fact that, as we'll talk about, I think there's good reason to think it is a temporary prison, well, then that's what we would call purgatory. Yeah. And this particular passage would match that particular aspect of the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, which says in purgatory, if there is any remaining debt of temporary punishment due for past forgiven sin, it is discharged through the purification experienced before entering into glory of the beatific vision. And this would be a text that would match and justify and at least hint in the direction of that particular aspect of the Catholic doctrine of purgatory.
Now, Karlo, I really do have to applaud you because you've done a great job in your book covering this particular area there. You cover a number of early church fathers as well. You do a really good job. I think people should check out your book. They can find that. Let me be clear here. I know they can find it on Amazon, but are they able to find it in shop.catholic.com as well? I imagine they've got it there, right?
Yeah, okay. That's Catholic Answers online store, correct.
Awesome. And this is a very good book. I've read it more than once. I recommend it to everyone that asks me about purgatory. It's a very, very good book. Now, let me ask you this, Karlo, because I read it, I look at the text, and I tend to I mean, come to the same conclusion you do, because we're reading about a judgment right there in verse 21. Now, there's one particular kind of very bad judgment. Now, you're going to be liable in danger of a judgment if you murder somebody. But of course, there's a different judgment if you, even if you have sinned against your brother, even if it's a lesser sin. So definitely different kinds of judgments. And we don't, what I think is incredible, Karlo, is that we're not reading about the man going into the prison and coming out after he pays the last farthing because of murder. Now, you wouldn't ever argue that. That would be a mortal sin. Yet the context here really does seem to me to be talking about venial sins. And it seems the language is very purgatorial. And when I say purgatorial, I mean temporal. It seems like the individual is going to get out. Now, here's another thing you cover very well in your book. What on earth is happening when we read of farthing or penny? What does that mean, Karlo?
Yeah, so you put a lot on the table there, William, to address your last question. So it seems as if you wanting to go in the direction of establishing the temporary nature of the prison, assuming that it is post-mortem, right? Yeah. So what I point out in my book is that the Greek word for farthing or penny there is kondrantes. Now, kondrantes is or was worth less than 2% of a day's wage for a first century agricultural laborer. That's what a kondrantes is. So that seems to suggest that there is some small payment that is being emphasized here. Now, a counter would be, well, you can't appeal to kondrantes in and of itself, because what Jesus could be meaning is that whenever you're in this prison, you're going to pay for every fault or crime or sin to the very smallest crime or sin. And that could apply either to an eternal prison or a temporary prison. So appealing to the word itself is not a solid argument for the temporary nature of the prison. We would have to nuance it a bit. But I do think, William, it's a start for this reason. Yeah. In Matthew chapter 18, where Matthew records Jesus talking about another prison, about the unforgiving servant who, the unforgiving servant owes, let's see here, how much was it? 10,000 talents. That's what it was. Well, whenever you go into the research of what a talent is, a talent of silver, it comes out equivalent to literally, right over 164,000 years worth of daily wages. Wow. That's what the unforgiving servant owed. That was his debt. In Matthew chapter 18, and of course, the king forgives the debt. The unforgiving servant does not remit the debt of those who owe him. The king finds out, throws him into prison, and Jesus says he's not going to get out until he pays all his debt. Now, one thing that struck me, William, was that in that passage, Matthew doesn't use the Greek word kondrantes. He just speaks of paying all the debt. But kondrantes is used here in Matthew chapter 5. So I think there is some significance in using kondrantes, but I do think we need to go a little bit further in order to establish the temporary nature of this prison. And one thing that I would say is that in Matthew chapter 18, we have good reason to think that the debt is unpayable. Okay. And therefore read the prison in Matthew 18 as to be eternal, because the debt was over 164,000 years of daily wages, right? Right. In Matthew chapter 5, we don't have any evidence in the text that the debt is unpayable. It's ambiguous. So think about this. You mentioned the judgments, right? Yeah. Notice how in verses, I think it was verse 21 through 22, where it seems to be progressing in degrees concerning the offense that you have against your brother, or the brother has against you. If you let's see, what was the first one? There was a first offense. I'd have to look at it real quick here in Matthew chapter 5, verse angry. There it is. If you're angry with your brother, liable to judgment. If you insult your brother by calling him, let's see here. If angry with his brother, you're liable to judgment. You insult your brother, liable to the council. There it is. And whoever says you fool, you shall be liable to hell of fire, right?
Yep.
So notice how the offense against the brother seems to be in degrees. The hell of fire would be constituted as a mortal sin. But notice that there are these other kinds of offenses that seem to be of a lesser degree than meriting the hell of fire.
Yeah.
And it's that offense that Jesus goes on to say, so if you're offering your gift at an altar and there you remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there. Then he goes on to talk about making friends quickly with your accuser, lest you be thrown into the prison. So being thrown into the prison could very well be on account of the lesser offenses against the brother that did not incur or merit the hell of fire offense. Okay, so we have that going on for us. So we have nothing in the text that would specify definitively that this debt in the prison is unpayable, namely the debt of the hell of fire. It could very well be the debt of temporary punishment for the lesser offense against the brother, okay?
Yeah.
So in Matthew 18, we have definitive evidence that it is unpayable. Here, we don't have any definitive evidence that it is unpayable. Therefore, William, I would argue that we are justified in reading the until statement, the until word within that phrase in a natural sense. He will not get out of the prison until he pays the last quadrantes, right? So given the fact that there's no evidence to justify the assumption that it is unpayable and therefore read until in the way that like Augustine would read it, right? That it just signifies paying that debt while he's in prison, which would be everlasting. I think we're justified in reading it in a temporary way that after the debt is paid, then the individual will get out. Now, here's another reason why, William, I think we are justified in reading it temporally as a temporary prison. Because the Jews, right, at the time of Christ, shortly before and at the time of Christ, they believed already in a temporary post-mortem state of existence. Correct. Where individuals paid debt of sin for sin, or at least had their sins remitted. And of course, that's 2 Maccabees 12, when they offering prayers that the sins of their fallen comrades would be remitted. So once we take that historical context and keep that in mind, where the Jews already believed in a postmortem temporary state of quote unquote prison or detainment or state of existence where sins are remitted. And then here you have Jesus within a Jewish context recorded by Matthew writing to Jews, talking about a prison where debt of punishment is going to be discharged on account of sin, and there's no evidence to definitively tell us it is an eternal postmortem punishment or postmortem prison. I think we have good reason to conclude that this is a postmortem temporary prison where one is discharging debt for those sins.
I think that the evidence really, really does favor that interpretation, Carlo. I totally agree. And he also mentioned that there really is strong evidence leaning towards this being in the afterlife, it being post-mortem. Now, in a bit, we can talk about a few early church fathers, if you will. But let me ask you this. When it comes to St. Augustine and his view of Matthew 5, this is why I appreciate these dialogues, and particularly people do yourself a favor, check out anything Carlo has put out, because Carlo, and I'm putting a plug in for you, brother, you're very fair with the way you deal with the material, and I think that is what we need to examine, and particularly noting Augustine. Now, let's be clear for the audience. Augustine doesn't provide a purgatorial reading of Matthew chapter 5. But I would argue, Carlo, I don't think that that's problematic, because if someone says, well, you guys, you don't have Augustine on your side, but Augustine believed in purgatory. We know that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, he's just saying that particular verse is not a good argument for purgatory because he's reading it differently. Right. Right.
Definitely. What would you say, in your opinion, Carlo, before we get to the fathers? By the way, in Carlo's book, Purgatory is for Real, which you can find a link down there. Carlo does deal with early church history. I recommend you get that book and check it out. In fact, give that book to people. Be a great Valentine's Day gift. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think would be your best evidence, Carlo, in Matthew 5 for a post-mortem reading? And by post-mortem, for people that are barely tuning in, we mean, let's break it down real simple for you, the afterlife.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I was using the term without explaining the term.
Not a problem.
Well, I give several lines of evidence here, the first of which is the use of the Greek word phulake by Matthew when he talks about this prison. What's interesting, William, although phulake is used for an earthly prison throughout the New Testament, it is interesting that St. Peter uses the same Greek word phulake in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19, and talking about those spirits who in the afterlife, to whom our Lord descended to preach on Holy Saturday, right? When he died, to deliver to them the good news and the gospel message. So phulake is in the Christian tradition used in reference to a post-mortem, after death, state of existence. And here's Matthew using that same Greek word within the context, immediate context of divine judgment. You already pointed this out, William, verses 21 through 22. The immediate context is about judgment. And I would argue this is not judgment enacted by some earthly judge, but this is judgment given by God, because notice whenever Jesus says, whoever says a fool to his brother, he shall be liable to the hell of fire. Well, guess what, bro? Ain't no earthly judge judging anybody to the hell of fire, right? That's Jesus, man. That's Almighty God. So this is a divine judgment. So the immediate context is judgment, taking in collaboration or complementing that with the idea that phulake, or prison, is used in reference to an after-death state of existence. Then we look at the wider context of Matthew's gospel itself, all about judgment. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, no, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, right? So in the wider context after Matthew chapter 5, it's about judgment. We could look at Matthew chapter 10, Matthew chapter 11, Matthew chapter 12. And so Matthew 5, divine judgment, which, by the way, I might add, comes after death. That's the assumption here. So Matthew 5, talking about a prison within the immediate context of judgment. The wider context of Matthew 5, Matthew 7, 10, 11, 12, is all about divine judgment, which comes after death. And so when we take that into consideration, we have good reason to think that this judgment and this prison is referring to divine judgment, which refers to a prison in the afterlife. And then we could even look at the wider context about eternal life itself in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5 is all about the Sermon on the Mount, right? And what is the Sermon on the Mount? It's about going to heaven. It's about avoiding hell, right? And so it's talking about all of these things concerning the afterlife. And then finally, William, I would say, as I point out in my book, I think we have good reason to think Jesus would be referring to something about the afterlife here, given his pedagogy with his parables. When he talks about the parable of the wedding feast in Luke chapter 14, he's not just teaching us about how to be humble at some wedding feast, right? No, he's talking about judgment, right? And the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25, he's not just giving us practical instructions about how to be prepared when things happen in life. No, he's talking primarily about our judgment in the afterlife. So too, in this parable that he's using or telling in Matthew chapter 5 about this prison and being thrown into prison by the judge, it's going to have a bearing on our afterlife experience. And so given all of that evidence, I think we have good reason to conclude this is a post-mortem prison, not strictly an earthly prison. Can we read it with regard to an earthly prison and extract some principles and apply it to our lives? Yes. But primarily, it's talking about an afterlife state of existence.
I totally agree with you, which is why it does remind me of the incredible St. Augustine, where he will very, very clearly note when providing an incredible exegesis of 1 Corinthians 3, you pay now in the afterlife, right now in this life, or it's possible you'll pay in the afterlife. But Karlo, here's a very, very good point, and I'm going to throw a little curveball at you because I've pondered this for some time, and I wonder what your thoughts are. Now, when we look in the early churches, you know it very well because you've done incredible research in this topic. We've got a number of early fathers that, they talk about purgatory, and when we mean purgatory, we mean post-mortem suffering for sins in order to be prepared to enter the kingdom of heaven. As Revelation chapter 21 is very clear, nothing unclean can enter heaven. The one thing I've noticed, Karlo, is you have various different ways in which the fathers talk about purgatory. Now, you might have, which we'll get to in a bit, St. Cyprian talking about this fiery prison. Then you might have, St. Cyril using different language. Then you might have St. Basil talking about kind of like going through a state of fiery purification. And then you may have, which we've talked about it before, the Passion of Perpetua, where it's really indicative of a location. Let me ask you this, Karlo, and I'm wondering what your thoughts would be. Is it possible in the afterlife, a purgatorial kind of suffering may be unique to various different individuals? Is that possible?
The answer would, I would answer yes to that question. And I point this out in my chapter in the book where I'm thinking through the theology of purgatory, dealing with a lot of questions within speculative theology, which this is an instance of. And there's a strong theological tradition that would say, yes, each of the souls in purgatory are experiencing their final purification in different degrees. And as St. Thomas Aquinas would point out, that is dependent on the amount of the remnants of sin that the soul takes with it into the afterlife, before the saved soul, a member of the elect, before entering into glory. So the more rooted unhealthy attachments are in the soul, which is an effect of sin, the more intense perhaps it will be for that soul, as opposed to some other soul whose unhealthy attachments to creaturely goods was very shallow and very thin. Or one soul might have more debt of temporary punishment due for past forgiven sin than some other soul, right? So you got somebody who's killing people all of their life and they're just living the gangster lifestyle, right? Or whatever throughout their whole life. They have a deathbed conversion. They come to Jesus and they die in friendship with him. That's a lot of debt of temporary punishment due for sin, right? Assuming that the sorrow on the deathbed was not sufficient enough to discharge all of that debt. So that soul's final purification is going to be of a different degree, whether whether with regard to intensity or duration, as opposed to some other soul who's holy all of the person is holy all of his life, and right before death he has some minor uncharitable thought, or he complains about the bed not being comfortable enough, and boom, he dies, right? Well, that's not going to be as much debt of temporary punishment due for that sin, right? That forgiven sin. So it is possible that the souls in purgatory, and I think there's good reason to think that the souls in purgatory would have differing degrees of experience, whether that be with regard to intensity or duration.
That's a great answer. Now, let me return to a comment that you made that I thought was really, really important. Because you carefully emphasize, as you do in your incredible book as well, purgatory is for the saved. Now, here's one thing that I hear often, Karlo, and you even hear it from people that are debating within the Protestant world, that have debated Catholics before and studied the issue. Where I was dialoguing not long back with a gentleman, and he told me, look, William, there is no second chance in the afterlife. Purgatory doesn't make any sense. Karlo, is purgatory about another chance in the afterlife?
And the answer is no. The church is very clear in her infallible teaching. I would underline infallible because I do argue in my book that this doctrine of purgatory is an infallible teaching of the church given to us, the Council of Florence, Council of Trent. But the answer to your question is no, it is not a second chance. And the reason why is because every soul in purgatory is a saved soul, a soul of a person who died in friendship with Jesus Christ and therefore is guaranteed heaven. So every soul in purgatory is numbered among the elect. So heaven is theirs. No possibility to lose that salvation and thereby not be numbered among the saved.
Karlo, that really does sound to me.
Now, let me clarify one thing. Something just dawned on me. If the question, we got to always make distinctions. If the question of a second chance is with regard to salvation, then the answer is no. But if by second chance you mean you get a second chance to discharge some remaining debt of temporary punishment that you could have done in this life, but failed to do so, then the answer would be yes. So it all depends on
great qualifier.
What the second chance is being directed towards, salvation or taking care of those remnants of sin.
Great qualifier there, Karlo. And to me, the way you break that down, I've heard people ask me, for William, is purgatory part of the gospel? And that really does sound like good news to me when you're guaranteed your salvation. But of course, you're going to have to be purified, which is completely understandable. You make a number of really good points there, Karlo. Now, Karlo, another thing that I really appreciate about the work you do is you do meticulous work in looking at the early church fathers. And we've talked about it before. I really enjoy talking about it. One figure that we know does get brought up very often, and I want to remind the audience, if you are an evangelical tuning in, or if you're a Reformed Protestant, you go and read the writings of John Calvin. John Calvin does bring up St. Cyprian and noted that St. Cyprian taught the belief in purgatory. Now, as far as Cyprian, Karlo, the one thing that I've noticed about him, I've always been fascinated. So when we read his writing, and I believe, I could be right, I could be wrong, Epistle 51, I think. I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head. Either 51 or 55, one of those two, I think, where it really does seem to me like Cyprian is conflating Matthew chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians 3 in his language of a purgatorial prison. Now, is Cyprian an important figure, and why is he important? What does he tell us about purgatory or about Matthew chapter 5, Karlo?
Yeah, so he does seem to be alluding to Matthew chapter 5, verses 25 through 26, because he talks about the prison and the uttermost farthing. That would strongly suggest he's referring to Matthew chapter 5, but he also uses the image of fire, suggesting he's thinking of fire spoken of by St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 through 15. But, I think it's important to situate St. Cyprian and what he has to say about this stuff within the context that he's dealing with a concern with regard to well-intentioned Christians who weren't strong enough to accept martyrdom for Christ and publicly denied him during the Decian persecution. And so his position was that they could be reconciled with the church, but would have to do penance, right? And so the question becomes, well, what happens if they didn't complete their penance in this life? And then his position is that they would have to complete it in the next. And Cyprian seems to be looking to Matthew chapter 5, verses 25 through 26, which we referenced and looked at as support of this position. So here's the relevant quote. He writes this: "It's one thing to stand for pardon, another thing to attain to glory. It's one thing then cast into prison, not to go out thence until one has paid the uttermost farthing. Another thing at once to receive the wages of faith and courage. It is one thing tortured by long suffering for sins, to be cleansed and long purged by fire. Another to have purged all sins by suffering. It's one thing, in fine, to be in suspense till the sentence of God at the day of judgment. Another thing to be at once crowned by the Lord. And so it's these parallels, William, that I think make evident that Cyprian has a post-mortem purgation, a temporary purgation in mind here. Notice how he says cast into the prison. So he's referring to Matthew 5. Now, notice this. One thing to be tortured by long suffering for sins, right? And long purged by fire. Another to be purged all sins by suffering. He seems to be contrasting. And he says right before that, another thing that wants to receive the wages of faith and courage, right? So one thing to be thrown into the prison, another thing to receive the wages of faith and courage. So the receiving of the wages of faith and courage clearly indicates that he's talking about heaven here, right? Yep. So what is this prison that he's talking about? Well, it can't be hell, because he talks about in this prison being tortured by long suffering for sins to be cleansed. So he's contrasting this receiving of wages of faith and courage, which he says later, at once crowned by the Lord. He seems to be associating the receiving of the wages of faith and courage to be at once crowned by the Lord, contrasting that with this prison where one is tortured by long suffering for sins to be cleansed, purged by fire. And that he associates with being in suspense to the sentence of God at the day of judgment. So there, Cyprian is clearly contrasting this immediate reception of wages of faith and courage, which is at once being crowned by the Lord. That would be an immediate entrance into heaven. With this prison, which in light of what he's comparing it to would be after death, a post-mortem state of existence, but not an eternal prison, because he says in this prison, one is tortured by suffering, purged through fire, and cleansed. And he associates it with being in suspense until the day of judgment. So I would argue Cyprian is referring to a temporary post-mortem state of existence, a state of existence where an individual is cleansed, goes through suffering, but by that suffering is cleansed, and therefore it not being hell. And it being temporary because at the day of judgment, in Cyprian's mind, it's no longer going to be.
Now, Carlo, really good points you do bring up there. The one thing that I'm really fascinated by is the very fact that you're right. You point out it is one thing to be crowned right away. So very, very similar to the language we find in 1 Corinthians 3, where there are rewards that are received immediately. But the incredible thing being is even in 1 Corinthians 3, we have one man being saved, and even the other one that undergoes the fiery purification is so saved as well. You clearly have that language there in Cyprian. I agree with you, that is post-mortem. How about we rewind a little bit? Is there any other North African theologian that does make the connection with Matthew chapter 5? And I know you know that I have on my mind a figure who, even though we will not call him an early church father, we can call him an early church writer, an ecclesiastical writer. As a mutual friend of ours, I remember he told me, he said, William, talking about Gary Machida, he said, William, I called Tertullian a part-time church father, because for a while there, he was a church father. And unfortunately, as you know, Carlo, he formally left the church, became a Montanist. We don't refer to him as a church father, but a great early church writer.
Sure.
Does he provide any insight into Matthew chapter 5?
Yeah, so Cyprian is not alone in seeing Matthew 5 as referencing some after-death temporary purification for a Christian. Tertullian does so as well. In his treatise on the soul, this dates to about AD 210, he writes this: that allegory of the Lord, and he's referring to Matthew 5, 25 through 26, is extremely clear and simple in its meaning. Beware unless as a transgressor of your agreement before God the judge. So that maps on what I was saying earlier. This is, divine judgment. He deliver you over to the angel who is to execute the sentence, and he commits you to the prison of Hades. That would imply it's post-mortem or after death, out of which there will be no dismissal until the smallest even of your delinquencies be paid off in the period before the resurrection. What can be more fitting meaning than this? What a truer interpretation. So Tertullian here clearly is referring to this prison as a state of existence in the afterlife. And that he views it to be temporary seems to be in the language that he's using, that the payment for the debt is even of the smallest sins, right?
Yeah.
What we would call venial sins. So the payment of the debt seems to be in Tertullian's mind temporal, that you're going to be paying no dismissal until the smallest even of your delinquencies be paid off. He seems to be reading the no dismissal until in its natural sense, that after the payment is made, even of the smallest sins, one would be able to be released. Now, again, that until could be read like Augustine is suggesting it to be read, and thus indicating an everlasting payment. But given that there is no definitive evidence to tell us that it is unpayable, it's reasonable to read it in its natural sense, unless we have further evidence to suggest otherwise. Yeah. And I think that's what Tertullian is doing here.
I totally agree with you. And I think that is why the incredible Pope Benedict he made that connection with a Tertullian, and noted how the language is very similar in the great Saint Cyprian. But he argues, and I would agree, that Saint Cyprian develops that imagery in an even greater fashion. Really, really good point there, Carlo. And I believe you do include Tertullian in your book, I believe, right?
Yes. Yeah, I have that quote there. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And I think with regard to Cyprian, it's even more pronounced in Cyprian, because he's trying to wrestle with this question, what do we do with these people who denied our Lord, repented, came back to the church, came back to our Lord? They need to make up for that with penance, right? And so the fundamental question is, what do they do? What happens if they don't make up for their rejection of our Lord through penitential action here in this life? So the whole point is to answer that question, and Cyprian answers it with that post-mortem temporary prison and suffering.
Another thing that I have found quite interesting is we look at another father by the name of Chromatius, who says, it is not possible to be sent out from the fire of punishment until one is paid for even the least sin by the washing of punishment. Now, again, Carlo, yet another father that we run into that to me really does seem like he is combining there the language you find in St. Paul's 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 5. To me, this really does lend even more evidence of the fact that you have early, and remember, we recognize not everyone was unanimous in Matthew 5, but you do have early testimonies that connect this post-mortem prison with a purgatorial post-mortem prison. They talk about it as being one. Now, I find that language to be quite significant. What would your thoughts be on that, Carlo?
Yeah, so what's interesting, William, is number one, one could say, well, he's speaking of this prison and not getting out until the fire of punishment is complete, like Augustine is. But here's one thought that comes to mind. Notice how Chromatius and Cyprian both seem to be alluding to 1 Corinthians 3, right? And mixing the imagery between 1 Corinthians 3, the fire, and Matthew 5, the prison of punishment. Now, what's interesting about that is that it is clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 through 15, that purification is temporary, because Paul says the one whose works are being burned up in the fire has built upon the foundation of Jesus. That's a saved Christian. And even Paul explicitly says the one whose works is being burned up in the fire, he will suffer loss, although he will be saved as only through fire. So that's clearly a temporary purification in 1 Corinthians 3. So if these early Christians, Cyprian and Chromatius, which by the way is at the early 5th century, if I'm correct here, about 407 AD. If these guys are speaking about a suffering or being purged of sins, and they're mixing 1 Corinthians 3 and Matthew 5, the prison of punishment which connects us to Matthew 5, would be temporary in their minds because they're seeing it in light of the fire of purification and 1 Corinthians 3, which is temporary.
Yeah.
So I think that's one line of argumentation that we could take in order to justify that these guys are speaking of not only a post-mortem prison, but a temporary post-mortem prison where one is purged of, in Chromatius's words, the fire of punishment. And now also too, I found in the journal New Testament Studies, there's an article entitled Prison, Penance, or Purgatory, the Interpretation of Matthew 5, 25 through 26, and Parallels by Nathan Eubank in 2018. And in this article, he actually quotes Chromatius and sees Chromatius as supporting a post-mortem temporary state of paying off debt of temporal punishment. So we're not out of bounds here. We're not lone rangers in reading Chromatius in this light. And the whole article is responding to the common interpretation of Matthew 5, 25 through 26 as referring to eternal punishment.
Gotcha.
And he's putting forward an argument that, no, we have good reason to begin reading this as postmortem temporary punishment. And he's referring to Chromatius as some support for that thesis.
That's a very good point there. So you have a scholarly examination of that as well. That is very good. And I think you bring up what a great point on 1 Corinthians 3. There's no doubt that's temporal. We read of the man being saved. And Carlo, you bring up a really good point, because unlike what we read in verse 17, where that man clearly is not saved, the one in verse 15 is saved. And 11 through 15, we have one that is saved instantly, and then we have one that must go through the fire. But both types of men, both are going to be, and if I'm correct, I think the Greek word is sophesetai, for saved. I think my memory might be wrong. Either which way, we've got the Greek word for saved there. So there's no way around it. You cannot argue that that fire is hellfire. You cannot, because you don't get out of hell. Hell is eternal, not
and the suffering that Paul says the individual undergoes and suffers loss. The suffering of the loss is on account of the works being burned up in the fire. Well, what are those works? Those works are represented by wood, hay, and straw. But we know that those works that the individual is suffering on account of is not mortal sins, because as you and I have just mentioned, this individual has built upon the foundation of Jesus, and those works, the wood, hay, and straw, those are works built on the foundation of Jesus, right? So it's clearly not referring to mortal sins, but venial sins, and that he will be saved, Paul says explicitly there. And I like how you contrasted it with an individual in verse 17. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. That is somebody who is guilty of mortal sin and will not be saved, in contrast to the individual who is being saved, but as through the fire.
And great point there as well, Carlo, because we don't have that temporal imagery in verse 17, and it lends itself even more to the fact that Chromatius and Cyprian and Tertullian wouldn't be referring to that man in verse 17, because they're talking about something that is temporal. So
he's not the 17, verse 17 man is not going through fire. It's the man in verse 15, right? 11 through 15.
That is correct.
And so for Chromatius, I'm going to mess up. I'm going to butcher his name here. Chromatius, there it is.
There we go.
Chromatius and Cyprian to be referring to Christians undergoing purification by alluding to that fire. Christians undergoing purification in the afterlife, alluding to that fire, 1 Corinthians 3:15, they would read it as temporary, to use that word.
No doubt. Before we wrap up, Carlo, I'd like to ask you, actually, before we wrap up our discussion in a bit, I'd love for you to talk about anything you're working on, future projects or anything. But do you have perhaps any closing thoughts on Matthew 5 maybe something we haven't touched upon, or anything you might have on your mind when it comes to this purgatorial prison in Matthew chapter 5?
No, I think that's pretty much it, William. I can't think of anything off the top of my head to share further than what we've already shared in our conversation together. Nothing's popping right now. Probably when we hang up, I'm going to say, darn. But nothing's coming to mind right now. It seems as if we've covered all the bases.
And to further go deep and further go deeper and really take everything in, people check out down there. There'll be a link. Purgatory is for real. And a great title, great cover of the book as well. If you're like me, you're going to have to own a copy, digital and physical as well. It's just how I am. I like owning both. Get a hold of both. You can find it. I'll provide a link to shop.catholic.com down there. You want to get on Amazon, you can do that as well, but it is available there. Shop.catholic.com. Karlo, you are a busy guy. You are working on a number of things, and I know every time I've had you on before, the audience loves your material, and they really want to know. And I want to know, what are you working on? Anything coming up down the pipeline?
Yeah, man, keep your eyes peeled. Within 2 months here, I'll have my new book coming out entitled Meeting the Protestant Response.
Wow. How
to answer common comebacks to Catholic arguments. And we're working on the manuscript right now. It's going through the editorial review. And so hopefully here in a couple of months, it'll be hot off the press, 2 or 3 months, I'm assuming. They have not given me a specific date yet. But the idea is I often get from folks, William, who are fired up about Catholic apologetics. Yeah. Why, with regard to Protestants, why don't Protestants get it? It's so clear, it is often said. Mm-hmm. Well, in the book, I'm actually going to answer that question and show you why many Protestants simply do not buy the common Catholic arguments that we've been giving for so many years with regard to the papacy, Mary, the saints, purgatory, etc. And so seeing how Protestant apologists respond to our Catholic arguments, and then to teach you how to show why those responses do not work and thus do not undermine the Catholic argument, allowing the Catholic argument to still stand. And so that's what the book is all about, meeting the Protestant response. So in a nutshell, it's basically counter the counter, rebut the rebuttal, defeat the defeater, that sort of thing.
And Karlo, I really do like that idea, because we're living in a time where you have Protestants, our evangelical friends, brothers and sisters, separated brothers, trying to offer rebuttals and trying to knock back arguments that have been used throughout history, which is why I really recommend your book. On Purgatory, you deal with the nitty-gritty in there. And this upcoming book, I'm going to have to grab you and bring you back on to talk about that book when it does come out. But brother, anything else? You have a webpage you want to direct people to? Anything else you want to put a plug in right now?
Sure. The floor, yeah, sure. Yeah. So, all of my work is at Catholic.com, but we produce so much in a day, it gets lost in the feed quite quickly. Yeah. So if they want to look at my articles and stuff, that's all at KarloBroussard.com. I have some of my videos there as well, although not all of them, but all of my articles at least are hosted at KarloBroussard.com. Also, too, I would just invite your listeners to say a little prayer for me, because I am on the journey of getting my doctorate in philosophy with Dr. Gavin Kerr. I don't know if your viewers are familiar with him. He's a bright Thomist philosopher, right about my age, and he's making a name for himself. And this is through St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland. So that's taking up a lot of my mental energy in writing my dissertation on divine immutability and the variability of creation. So I would appreciate some prayers on that. And then also, too, I'm doing a little research for my next book project, putting it all together. It'll be on relativism, but it's not going to be the same old stock responses of the old relativism. There's some new, fresh stuff, William, that I'm going to tease you with a bit. that I can't wait to start writing on. So we're working on that possible project right now. So that's in the pipe. So a whole lot of irons in the fire, brother.
And you will be in my prayers, and I know the audience will be praying for you, praying for your wonderful family. Brother, I have greatly appreciated your time today. Thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to dialoguing with you again in the future. Karlo, thank you very much, and I will talk to you again soon, brother. God bless you.
William, thanks for having me. God bless you, brother.